How's it going, everyone? It's Chow here, and today we are going to talk a little bit about the kidneys, the nephron, as well as water and salt balance. So let's get started. Okay, so if we're going to talk about water and salt balance, we have to discuss briefly about the excretory system. So the excretory system controls the overall balance of salts within the blood, as well as the total overall blood volume. The excretory system basically helps maintain solute concentrations within extracellular fluid, right? And this can help determine water balance within the cells. This is important because ionic composition of extracellular fluid, basically high or low concentrations of certain ions within and outside of the cell, can influence cellular function. So we can think about perhaps like depolarization and how that can affect cell function. In addition, we must remove those extraneous nitrogenous waste produced by the cell. So nitrogenous waste is not exactly a good thing to kind of collect in our body, and we have to figure out a way to get rid of it. So the key component of the excretory system is this particular guy right here, which is the kidney. So the kidney is one of our main excretory organs. It's composed of many little subunits called nephrons. So the nephron is basically the main functional unit, the main subunit or main functional unit of the kidney. And the kidney is responsible for filtering blood and then, of course, reabsorption of certain solutes, as well as eventually pushing all that material into the collecting duct and then eventually into the bladder for excretion. So the thing about the kidney is that it's producing concentrated waste. You want to retain stuff that's necessary and needed, but anything else that's waste, you want to concentrate it so you don't lose water in the process. So the kidney is very important in maintaining those water and blood pressure levels. Now, the question is, what exactly brings the blood, right, to the kidneys to be filtered? Obviously, the easy answer is those are the arteries and capillaries, right? So they're taking the blood away from the heart towards other organ systems, and the kidney is no different. So more specifically, we have renal arteries that actually end up supplying the blood to be filtered by the kidneys. Eventually, we have renal veins that end up draining the kidney. So each nephron is actually closely articulated with a capillary network out in the yonder space over here. And the nephron is also the location where basically filtration and reabsorption actually occurs. So you have the kidney here made of small subunits, the functional units called nephrons, and it's at the nephron where filtration and reabsorption occurs. Okay, so let's go through briefly the steps of what exactly happens in this nephron, which is shown over here. So this is a nephron over here. And through the first step, we have basically filtration. And filtration is very key, but one of the things that help out with the filtration process is the glomerulus over here. So it's the main interaction site of blood and the actual nephron itself. Essentially, it's just a structure made of capillary beds which allow for exchange of materials, right? So it's highly permeable to solutes and small molecules, but relatively impermeable to large molecules. And then the blood pressure in the capillaries drives the initial filtration. Eventually, we also have this outer portion over here called the Bowman's capsule. And here in the Bowman's capsule, the solutes and water that's actually filtered out of the glomerulus actually goes into this little capsule over here called the Bowman's capsule. So that's the first step with filtration. Eventually, we have reabsorption, or more specifically, tubular reabsorption. So the filtrate that's basically filtered out of the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule enters into the tubules. So it moves first into the proximal convoluted tubule over here. Eventually, it moves to the loop of Henle down here. And then finally, it moves to the distal convoluted tubule, which eventually goes to the collecting duct. So the proximal convoluted tubule allows for reabsorption of major substances such as glucose or vitamins. The loop of Henle is the site of reabsorption of water and also salt, and then eventually the concentrating of urine. So I believe the descending loop over here is relatively permeable to water, whereas the ascending loop over here is not so much permeable to water, but is permeable to things like ions. And then after this little countercurrent multiplier over here, you allow for a concentration of the urine. Finally, we get to the distal convoluted tubule, which allows for sort of final regulation of water, urea, and salts until it goes, the waste product goes into the collecting duct. So we also have this other thing called tubular secretion, in addition to tubular reabsorption, which is shown over here. So you can see that tubular reabsorption, usually of waters, ions, nutrients, they're basically returned to blood through the capillary bed. Whereas we have tubular secretion, which is basically addition of waste products into the filtrate over here. So reabsorption, getting rid of the stuff and saving it in the body, whereas secretion is getting rid of the stuff from the body and putting it into the filtrate. So both active and passive transport are involved in the movement of solutes, but the key thing is that you result in concentrated urine at the very end. Okay. So when we're looking at rates of filtration, one thing we have to understand is this over here, which is the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. So constant glomerular filtration rate requires blood supplied to kidneys to be under adequate pressure. So you need a certain amount of pressure to allow for this thing here to happen naturally and normally. So constant GFR is needed to drive filtration. But sometimes you have a drop in GFR, and when GFR falls, the blood pressure also decreases, which basically can affect how much or maybe even prevent proper filtration levels. So the question is, how exactly does the body fix this problem? Well, there's a good answer to that, and that is with hormone regulation. So we have specialized cells in the distal convoluted tubule that kind of perceives change in solute concentration of the filtrate. And we can have this release of renin. And renin here will eventually activate angiotensin. So we talked about angiotensin in one of our other lectures, I think the circulation lecture. So one of the things that you might want to think about is what exactly does angiotensin do? And angiotensin does some pretty important things. So first of all, it stimulates thirst, which eventually can lead to more liquid in the system. So that increases the blood volume, which ultimately increases blood pressure. So remember, we're increasing blood pressure again. We also have potentially the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex is a place that releases this hormone called aldosterone, along with other things like cortisol. But it releases aldosterone, and aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption. So water always follows sodium. So if you're using sodium and reabsorbing sodium, the water wants to follow the sodium. So basically, through absorption of sodium, you also absorb water as well. And so this ultimately stimulates peripheral vasoconstriction, which thus increases pressure. Okay. So we have, in summary, hormone regulation that can basically control your GFR, and this release of angiotensin, in summary, raises blood pressure, raises the blood volume, and solves the issue of the GFR from falling. Okay. So that should make a lot of sense. Now, there are other hormones in play as well. So we have the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also known as vasopressin. And the question that I often get is, what exactly does ADH do? Well, what is a diuretic? So that should be a key term over here. So we're going against, right, antidiuretic hormone. So, of course, ADH increases water reabsorption, mostly in the collecting duct, right? So by increasing absorption of water, you increase blood volume. That increase in blood volume leads to an increase in blood pressure. And this increase of ultimately, an increase of baroreceptor activity inhibits the release of ADH. But if you need to reabsorb more water, you release ADH, and so more water is collected back and reabsorbed in the filtrate. So what's really fascinating here is that we have some things that can potentially mess up the system. And one of them is caffeine and the other is alcohol. So caffeine and alcohol actually inhibit the antidiuretic hormone, aka vasopressin. And inhibition of ADH actually leads to less water reabsorption, which ultimately leads to urine production and frequent urination. So if you're drinking a lot of caffeine or you're drinking a lot of alcohol, the reason why you have to use the restroom more frequently is because these things over here are inhibiting ADH, so there's less water being absorbed, and so therefore you have more urine available. So it's through sort of the combination of ADH along with the combination of things such as aldosterone that can increase water absorption and ultimately help maintain the GFR. So that's basically all I have for water and salt balance. This is a topic that's often covered in laboratory as well, so please pay attention to your lab manual as well as your textbook and ask your professor or your TF as to what you need to know for the exam and so on and so forth. And as always, I hope you found this useful, and best of luck studying, and I will see you in the next video.